Good evening and welcome back. Pull your chair a little closer or lean into the dark wherever you are. Those of you sitting by a window with the rain coming down, those of you in a car with the engine off, those driving long empty roads at an hour when no one else is awake. Drop a note if you feel like it. Tell me where you're listening from. I always want to know. There is something particular about the act of sharing a story across distance, across the silence between one mind and another. And tonight, the story I want to tell you is one of the oldest I know how to tell. Not old in the way that things grow dusty and lose their edges. Old in the way that bedrock is old. The thing underneath everything else, the pressure that shaped the rest. We are going to talk about angels. Not angels as greeting cards, imagine them. Not angels as decorations painted on the arched ceilings of chapels where tourists murmur in subdued voices and try not to look like tourists. We are going to talk about the seven, the ones who stand at the center of the oldest cosmological architecture in human memory, the ones whose names have been whispered in languages long since swallowed by time, the ones who appear in texts so old that scholars argue whether to call them scripture or mythology or both. I want to try to tell you where they came from, not in the way a theologian would tell it, in the way a story should be told, which is to say honestly, uncertainly, with room for the versions that contradict each other, and with the understanding that the truth of a myth is never located in any single telling of it. So, in the beginning, which is itself a strange phrase, because the beginning implies a before, and the before implies something that existed to notice there was no beginning yet. But this is the kind of paradox that cosmogonies are built to swallow whole, so let us allow it. In the beginning, there was the first breath, the first word, the first vibration in a medium that had no name, because there was nothing yet that could name it. Different traditions will give this moment different colors. The Zoroastrian texts speak of a vast, luminous expanse, uncreated, uncaused, the Ahura, the Lord of Wisdom, existing in perfect and infinite light before the first act of creation split that light from the darkness that would become its adversary. The Jewish mystical traditions, which we will spend considerable time in tonight, speak of the Ein Sof, the endless, the infinite without limit, the divine reality that precedes all attributes and all names, the ground of being that cannot be spoken of directly because speech requires subject and object, and the Ein Sof is before that distinction. The earliest Mesopotamian materials that fed into both of these traditions, the vast river culture theologies of Sumer and Akkad, speak of Apsu and Tiamat, the sweet waters and the salt. The primal mingling before the world was separated into its differentiated forms. What matters for our purposes is not which version is literally true. What matters is what all of them agree on. There was a state of undifferentiated wholeness, and then there was an act, a choice, a division, a catastrophic generative rupture, and from that rupture came multiplicity, came light and dark, came above and below, came the terrifying fecundity of a creation that does not know how to stop making things. The Kabbalistic tradition, the Jewish mystical framework that gave us perhaps the most elaborately imagined angelology in human history, speaks of this moment in terms of the Tsimtsum, the contraction, the infinite God, in order to make room for creation, withdrew into itself, contracted, left a void. And into that void, light entered, the divine light, the Or Ein Sof, streaming in through a narrow channel. And the vessels that were meant to contain that light shattered. The shards fell, the sparks scattered, and the entire project of creation in this vision is an attempt to gather the sparks back, a cosmic recovery operation that will not be complete until the last fractured shard of divine light finds its way home. Into this shattered space, the angels came, or rather, they were made in the making of it. Some traditions say they preceded creation. Some say they were created on the second day. Some say they have always existed and always will, uncreated, necessary, the way mathematical truths are necessary. The Book of Enoch, that strange and magnificent text preserved outside the official canon precisely because it was too vivid, too detailed, too dangerously interested in the architecture of heaven, speaks of the angels as the watchers, as the holy ones, as beings of fire and light who stood before the throne and whose voices were the first music, and whose presence was so overwhelming that even to look at one was to be irrevocably changed. The Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran. Those desert ascetics with their white linen and their terror of impurity understood themselves to be already living among the angels. Their liturgy and the angelic liturgy synchronized across the membrane between the human and the divine, a single choir split between two registers. But the seven are a specific category, and their specificity matters. The idea of 7 high angels, 7 princes of heaven, 7 who stand before the throne, appears across an astonishing range of ancient traditions with enough similarity to suggest either a common source or something more unsettling. The possibility that this number, this configuration, mapped onto something real in the structure of human religious imagination, appeared independently because it was always already there. The Babylonians had 7 planetary deities, 7 divine judges, 7 gates through which the dead must pass. The Persians had the Amisha Spentas, the holy immortals, the 6 emanations of Ahura Mazda plus Ahura Mazda himself, making 7 in total, each governing a domain of creation, each corresponding to an aspect of the good creation that evil seeks to corrupt. The Jewish tradition crystallized around 7 named archangels. Though the canon was contested, the names shifting between texts, some names appearing in some traditions and not others. The whole angelic bureaucracy in a state of productive flux for centuries. The names most commonly associated with the 7 in the most widely received tradition: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, Sarakael, Raguel, Remiel. You know some of those names. Everyone knows some of those names. But the story of who they are, not what they do, not their titles, but who they are in the deep sense, where they come from, what it cost to make them. That is the story I want to tell you tonight. And it begins, as almost all stories of this kind begin, with a catastrophe. Before the 7 were defined as the 7, before the hierarchy was established and the names were fixed, there was a condition of raw angelic potential, a vast population of divine beings, created and uncreated, formed and unformed, luminous entities existing in a space that was not quite a place, serving a purpose that was not quite a purpose, but more like an orientation, the way a compass needle orients without being told to orient. They were made of fire, of the specific fire that does not consume, the fire that is itself a form of attention rather than a chemical process. They were made of the first exhalation of the divine will. They were made of the mathematics underlying music. There was no hierarchy then. This is the detail I want you to hold on to, because it will become important. There was no hierarchy. There were ranks and dignities and differences in luminosity. Some angels burned brighter, some moved faster, some were older in whatever sense age means to a being that does not age. But there was no fixed chain of command, no throne list, no established precedence. The divine light was distributed across the whole vast population of angelic beings without a formal mechanism of distribution. And in that condition of relative equality, relative freedom, there was something we might as well call happiness. I don't know if that's the right word. The narrator in me, and I should say, I am aware of how strange it is to claim to narrate the interior states of beings that may never have existed outside the human need to imagine them. The narrator in me wants a word that is larger than happiness and smaller than bliss, something like the steady hum of a system operating at its proper resonance. That it could not last, because nothing that exists in relation to other things can last unchanged. The moment you have more than one, you have the conditions for hierarchy. The moment you have hierarchy, you have the conditions for resentment. The moment you have resentment, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. The first movement toward what we would come to call the Seven was not an act of appointment or creation. It was an act of revelation. The oldest stories suggest that the primordial divine light was not distributed evenly, was never distributed evenly, and that what we interpret as hierarchy was actually a difference in capacity, not a difference in dignity, but a difference in what a given being could hold. A river is not superior to a stream because it holds more water, but if you need to move a significant quantity of water quickly, you choose the river. And so the first seven, who would become the highest seven, were not elevated so much as recognized as the vessels most capable of bearing what needed to be born. What needed to be born was the knowledge of the divine will, not mere instruction. Instructions can be passed down the chain, simplified at each step, translated into the terms of the recipient. But the knowledge of the will itself, the direct apprehension of what creation was for, what the whole shattered and gathering itself project of existence was directed toward. This required something close to a mirror, a surface that could receive the full intensity of the divine light without fracturing, without distortion, without the kind of corruption that comes from a translation done in too much haste. 7 is not an arbitrary number. In the Kabbalistic system, the Sephirot, the 10 emanations of divine energy through which the Ein Sof interacts with creation, include 7 active manifesting aspects. The lower 7, the ones that touch the world. The 7 archangels correspond to these 7 manifesting aspects, one to each, a living interface between the structure of divine reality and the structure of created reality. Michael corresponds to Hesed, loving kindness, the boundless grace that does not count cost. Gabriel corresponds to Gevurah, strength, judgment, the necessary severity that love without limit cannot provide. Raphael corresponds to Tiferet, beauty, harmony, the reconciliation of the two poles. Uriel corresponds to Malkuth, the kingdom, the earth-facing presence of the divine, the closest to the ground. The other three, Sarakael, Raguel, Remiel, correspond to Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, victory and endurance, glory and acknowledgement, foundation and connection. This is the architecture, now for the catastrophe that was required to establish it, because the seven were not simply assigned their roles. They earned them, or rather, they survived them. The Great War in heaven is not, in the oldest sources, the story of Lucifer's fall. That is a later narrative, a specific and dramatic crystallization that takes elements from multiple earlier traditions and concentrates them into a single villain with a legible motivation. The older stories are stranger, less comfortable, more distributed in their blame. The older stories describe a conflict that was not simply good against evil, but something more like a constitutional crisis, a disagreement about the fundamental nature and purpose of creation that split the angelic population along lines that did not map neatly onto virtue and vice. The question at the center of this conflict, the question that made it unavoidable, was, what are we for? Some of the heavenly beings, and here some, is doing a lot of work, because we are talking about entities that may have numbered in the millions, in the billions, whose population the texts describe with terms that dissolve into poetry, as the stars of heaven, as the sand of the sea. Some of them understood their existence in purely relational terms. They existed to serve, to attend, to carry out the purposes of the divine will as those purposes were communicated, without question, without reservation, with a completeness of self-offering that left nothing private, nothing held in reserve. They were, in essence, instruments that had the capacity for consciousness but chose moment to moment not to exercise it as independent will. Others understood themselves differently. These, and the tradition, will eventually call them the fallen, though in the moment of their rebellion they would not have used that word. These understood themselves as beings whose capacity for consciousness was the point, whose ability to question and to desire and to make independent choices was the gift and the dignity and the responsibility that distinguished them from mere mechanism. They understood the divine creation as a project of making beings capable of genuine relationship, and genuine relationship requires that both parties be genuinely free, and freedom that is never exercised is not freedom. Both of these positions have a theological coherence that is part of what makes the story so difficult and so interesting. The beings who fell were not simply wrong in any simple sense. They were wrong in the particular way that a true thing, pushed past its proper proportion, becomes its own opposite. Freedom, absolutized, becomes the refusal of love. Love, absolutized, becomes the refusal of freedom. The whole of creation exists in the tension between these two poles, and the seven archangels are, among other things, the living embodiment of that tension, held in a stable equilibrium. The war, if we call it a war, and the texts call it a war, though the word implies a physicality that the tradition simultaneously insists upon and undermines, the war unfolded across an unspecified duration in a space that was not exactly a place. The book of Revelation, that fever dream culmination, of the whole Jewish-Christian apocalyptic tradition gives us Michael at the head of the loyal angels, driving the dragon and its followers from heaven. This is the image most people know. But the older sources, the texts that the canonical scriptures were drawing on and transforming, give us something more complex. The Book of Enoch, the Qumran War Scroll, the fragments of other apocalyptic texts preserved in translation and in quotation, describe a conflict that was not primarily military, but ontological. A struggle over what kind of reality the created world would be permitted to have, what the terms of existence would be for the creatures who would eventually inhabit the lower realms. On one side, beings who wish to descend into the created world and participate in it on their own terms, to take wives from among the daughters of men, as the Genesis account has it, which is a way of saying, to enter into the created order not as servants and messengers, but as actors, principals, beings with stakes in the outcome and desires of their own. These are the Watchers in the Enochic tradition. And here I need to pause, because the Watchers are a deeply ambiguous category. They are not simply villains. Some of the knowledge they brought to humanity, the arts of metallurgy, the calendar, writing, medicine, was genuine knowledge, genuine good, the kind of civilizational gift that makes human life not merely sustainable, but meaningful. The problem was not the gift. The problem was the mode of giving, the decision to intervene without sanction, to establish a relationship with the created world that exceeded the terms of the commission. A doctor who performs surgery without consent has done something wrong, even if the surgery was necessary. On the other side, beings who resisted this descent, who insisted on the maintenance of the boundary, the holy separation between the heavenly and the earthly, who understood the created world as a realm that must be allowed to develop according to its own nature before the divine presence could enter it fully without destroying it. These became, or their most capable members became, the Seven. Not because they were stronger, necessarily, or braver, but because they were able to hold the tension, to stand at the border between the divine and the created, to serve as the interface, without either collapsing into the purely divine or being absorbed into the purely created. The establishment of the heavenly hierarchy, the fixing of the Seven in their roles, the definition of their domains, the assignment of their specific functions, came after the resolution of this war. And here the traditions diverge in interesting ways about what resolution means. The Enochic tradition is grim. The Watchers are bound, cast into dark valleys to await the final judgment, their giant children destroyed in a flood that serves also as a cleansing. The later Christian tradition gives us Michael driving the dragon into the pit. The Zoroastrian tradition gives us a cosmic dualism in which the resolution is deferred. The good creation and the evil counter-creation are in conflict across vast spans of time, and the final resolution will not come until the Saoshyant, the cosmic savior, appears to lead the armies of Ahura Mazda to final victory. The Jewish tradition is characteristically reluctant to resolve the tension, content to hold the conflict as ongoing, the present condition of the world a theatre of ongoing struggle. What all of them agree on is this: from the chaos of the primordial conflict, a structure emerged, a form crystallized. The 7 highest beings were recognized, named, given their domains, sent to their posts, and the order of the cosmos, imperfect, contested, under constant pressure from the forces that sought to unmake it. The order of the cosmos became something that could, at least in principle, be maintained. Michael was the first to be named. In almost every tradition, the name means, "Who is like God?" A question posed as a declaration, the battle cry of the loyal host, the challenge thrown at the face of the fallen who wish to claim equality with the divine. Michael is the commander, the prince, the one who leads the armies of heaven. He is depicted in the early texts as a figure of immense and almost terrifying luminosity, not the gentle guardian angel of popular imagination, but a war leader, a divine soldier whose mercy is real, but whose power to execute judgment is equally real. The Qumran scrolls give him the title of the Prince of Light, and his opposite, the Prince of Darkness, is given the title Belial, the worthlessness, the meaninglessness, the void at the center of the rebellion. Michael's story, as the tradition tells it, begins with an act of recognition. Before the war, before the hierarchy was fixed, Michael was simply one of the highest burning lights among the angelic host, distinguished by luminosity, by something the tradition struggles to name, something like clarity of perception. The ability to see the divine will not just as a command, but as a principle, a logic, a love that could be understood rather than merely obeyed. There is a story, not in the canonical texts, but in the rabbinic and pseudepigraphical literature, that before the creation of humanity, when the divine proposed to make beings in the divine image, Michael was the first among the angels to assent without reservation, without the anxious questioning that would doom others. Not because he did not see the risk. He saw the risk clearly. He assented anyway. And that clarity of vision, that willingness to commit to a creation that might fail, became the foundation of his commission. His upbringing, if we can use that word for a being whose development is not temporal in the human sense, was in the direct presence of the divine light. The Merkava tradition, the Jewish mystical tradition of the divine chariot, describes Michael standing at the right hand of the divine throne, which in ancient Near Eastern protocol is the position of the most trusted advisor, the one whose counsel is sought before all others. He learned, again I acknowledge the strangeness of this language, he learned the divine will not from teachers, but from proximity, the way a child learns the texture of home, not from being taught, but from breathing it in, from the specific quality of the light in the afternoons, the particular sound of a voice moving through walls. Michael breathed the divine will. It became his substance. His first great commission was to assist in the binding of the fallen. This is his defining trial in the Enochic tradition, not the final war of revelation, which comes later, but the earlier crisis, the descent of the Watchers, the contamination of the earth with unauthorized divine presence. Michael was sent with other high angels to execute the divine judgment on the Watchers and their offspring. The text is clinical about this in a way that is more disturbing than any amount of dramatic description would be. He bound them, he cast them, he did what needed to be done and returned to his post. There is no moment of hesitation described in the oldest sources, no sign of ambivalence about what was being done to beings who were, after all, of the same kind as himself, beings he had stood beside in the time before the war. The later texts will introduce hesitation, will give him a moment of grief for the fallen. The rabbinic tradition has a lovely and devastating story about how the angels began to sing when the Egyptian armies were drowned in the Red Sea, and God silenced them. You may not sing while my creatures are drowning. But in the Enochic text, Michael is an instrument, a very bright, very precise instrument. This is part of his cost, because there is always a cost. The tradition is consistent on this point, across cultures, across centuries. The great figures of cosmic significance do not pass through their defining moments unchanged. Michael, the prince of the divine armies, the one who stands at the right hand of the throne, carries in his luminosity something of the weight of what he was required to do. He knows what it is to execute a divine judgment that is just and still looks, from one angle, like destruction. He knows what it is to fight your own kind. This knowledge is not a wound, exactly, but it is not nothing. It is the kind of knowledge that does not allow you to return to the state before you had it. His legacy is the maintenance of the boundary. Every time a tradition invokes Michael as protector, as guardian, as the patron of soldiers and police and all those who use force in service of order, they are invoking this quality, not the absence of violence, but violence held within a frame of justice, the willingness to do what is necessary, understood clearly, without either enthusiasm or reluctance. Gabriel's story is different in almost every particular, and this is, I think this matters, though I am not entirely sure why I'm insisting on it. This is the tradition's way of telling us that the seven are not iterations of a single type, but genuinely distinct principles, distinct modes of being in relation to the divine. Gabriel means God is my strength, or possibly God's hero, or possibly the mighty one of God. The etymology is one of those satisfyingly contested cases where the different possible readings each illuminate something about the figure. Gabriel is the messenger, the herald, the one who appears at the hinge moments of sacred history to announce the thing that is about to change everything. Gabriel comes to Daniel in the night and explains the visions that have left the prophet shaking. Gabriel comes to Mary and says, "Do not be afraid." Gabriel, in the Islamic tradition, where the angel appears as Gabriel, is the one who transmits the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad across the 23 years of the prophetic mission. Gabriel's particular quality, the thing that distinguishes this figure from all the other angelic messengers in the tradition, is the capacity to bring news that terrifies without losing the tenderness that the terrified person needs. This is much harder than it sounds. Truth delivered without love is a weapon. Love offered without truth is a comfort that does not actually help. Gabriel, across all these traditions, is the one who manages to hold both at once, to say the thing that will shatter the ordinary world, and to say it in such a way that the recipient survives the shattering and can begin to understand what comes next. The tradition on Gabriel's early history, his origin, his upbringing in the angelic sense, is thinner than for Michael, and I suspect this is significant. Michael's story is the soldier's story, the story of someone shaped by training and trial and visible action. Gabriel's story is the courier story, and couriers are people defined less by what happens to them than by what they carry. The texts give us flashes of Gabriel in action, interpreting visions, announcing births, governing the element of fire in some enumerations, the element of water in others, governing the whole sphere of the moon in the astrological theological framework that early Christianity and Judaism shared with their surrounding cultures. But they are strangely reluctant to tell us what happened to Gabriel between missions, what it is like to be the bearer of announcements. Let me collect the thread here for a moment, because I realize we are moving through this very quickly, and the weight of it deserves something slower. We have established the primordial condition, the undifferentiated divine light, the Tsimtsum, the shattered vessels, the sparks scattered through the void. We have established the crisis, the conflict among the angelic host about the nature of their existence and their relationship to the created world. We have established the resolution, imperfect, ongoing, the seven recognized and named and set to their posts. And we have begun the stories of the individual seven: Michael, the soldier of the divine will; Gabriel, the messenger who does not flinch from the truth. We have two more high figures to examine before we can arrive at the great central conflict that defines the whole tradition, the moment when all of these stories converge into a single terrible and magnificent event. Raphael. The name means God heals or God has healed. And there is, in that past tense, in that has, something of the retrospective quality of healing. The way healing is always a story told from after the fact, from the perspective of someone who has already survived the thing they thought might kill them. Raphael is the healer, the physician, the one associated in the tradition with medicine and with the restoration of what has been broken. In the book of Tobit, that strange and lovely novella embedded in the deuterocanonical scriptures, the story of a righteous man struck blind, his son's journey to recover a debt, the demonic possession afflicting the woman the son will marry. In this story, Raphael appears disguised as a human traveler and accompanies young Tobias across the dangerous landscape, offering practical guidance, protecting him from the demon Asmodeus, ultimately revealing the cure for Tobias's father's blindness, and then, at the story's end, revealing his identity with a statement that is one of the most quietly astonishing things in the entire tradition. He says, "I am Raphael, one of the seven holy angels who offer the prayers of the saints and enter into the presence of the glory of the Holy One. Do not be afraid. The formula is so familiar by now. Do not be afraid, fear not, be not afraid, that it can lose its force, but sit with it for a moment. A being of inconceivable power and luminosity, a figure who stands in the direct presence of the divine, who has just successfully guided a young man through a journey full of mortal danger and facilitated the defeat of a demon. This being, at the moment of self-revelation, leads with reassurance, with tenderness. The announcement of who he is comes second. The first priority is the safety of the person who is now afraid of him. This is Raphael's quality, and it runs through all of the tradition's depictions of him. He is the one who meets you in the wound. The Book of Enoch assigns Raphael the specific commission of healing the earth after the contamination caused by the descent of the Watchers. The earth itself is understood as wounded, as scarred, and Raphael is sent to repair it. This is not a military operation. This is not the delivery of a message. This is patient, attentive, intimate work. The work of someone who has looked at broken things for long enough to know what whole looks like, and who can therefore find the path from one to the other. His origin, as the tradition imagines it, is in the direct contemplation of the divine attribute of mercy. If Michael is formed in the attribute of strength and Gabriel in the attribute of truth, Raphael is formed in the attribute of healing mercy, the quality in the divine nature that does not simply mourn the broken thing, but actively works to restore it. He learned his craft in the angelic sense by attending the great ruptures of the primordial creation, the shattering of the vessels, the wounds of the war, the scars left in the fabric of reality by the fallen's departure, and understanding them not as final states, but as in-progress conditions. Nothing is broken permanently. This is Raphael's theological claim, his mode of reading reality. The work of healing is never done, but it is always being done. His trial, the test that defined him, was the commission to descend into the created world and heal Tobit's blindness, a commission that sounds simple and was not, because to descend into the created world and work within its conditions means accepting the constraints of that world, the misunderstandings, the slowness, the necessity of disguise, the inability to simply will the healing into existence and have it be so. Raphael had to accompany Tobias, had to wait, had to work through the young man's fumbling efforts, had to work through the mundane means of a fish's liver and heart and gall, had to let the story unfold at its own pace, because that is how healing works in a world made of matter and time. And the cost of this commission was the particular frustration of a being whose nature is to make whole, forced to watch the incompleteness of the process for the duration of a human journey, the waiting, the not yet. He came out of it. Here the tradition is silent about what he felt, and that silence is itself significant. He came out of it more patient, if patience is the right word for a quality that transcends the conditions in which patience is usually formed. Or perhaps the word is trust. He came out of it with a deeper trust in the process, in the slow unfolding of healing through natural means, through relationship, through the willingness of human beings to take a journey they did not fully understand in service of a restoration they could not yet see. Uriel is the fourth, and perhaps the most complex of the seven, and the one I find myself wanting to linger on longer than I probably should, though I notice I said probably, and that is already a hedge, already a step back from the honest admission that I want to linger on Uriel, because Uriel is the one who seems most aware of the cost of existing in the position the seven occupy. The name means God is my light, or fire of God, and this has led to Uriel's traditional association with fire, particularly the fire of divine presence, the pillar of fire that led the Israelites through the wilderness, the burning coal that touched Isaiah's lips and purified them, the fire that is simultaneously the most welcoming and most dangerous of the elements, the one that can warm you or consume you with equal facility depending on the nature of your relationship to it. In the tradition of the Book of Enoch, Uriel is the regent of the luminaries, the sun, the moon, the stars, and his specific commission includes the maintenance of the cosmic calendar, the ordering of time itself into its regular cycles, the keeping of the great celestial clock that makes the world of seasons and tides and the human calendar of feasts and harvests possible. This is not a glamorous role. Michael fights, Gabriel announces, Raphael heals, Uriel maintains. Uriel ensures that the sun rises when it is supposed to rise and sets when it is supposed to set, that the moon waxes and wanes in its proper sequence, that the stars take their regular paths across the sky. This is the work of someone who has understood that the grandest gift any being can give to a created world is regularity, the gift of being able to trust that tomorrow will resemble today enough to make planning possible, that the seeds planted in spring will encounter summer when they are ready to encounter it. I should tell you, and I'm uncertain about whether to include this, and I'm including it anyway because it keeps pulling at me. There is a tradition in some of the pseudepigraphical texts that Uriel is the angel who stood at the gates of Eden with the flaming sword, the cherubim who prevented the return of humanity to the primordial garden after the expulsion. This tradition is not universally accepted, and some sources assign this role to a different figure entirely. But if it is Uriel, if the keeper of time is also the keeper of the gate between the lost paradise and the fallen world, then his role takes on an additional dimension of tragedy. He does not stand at the gate because he wishes to exclude. He stands at the gate because the gate must be kept, because the conditions that made the garden possible no longer obtain, because the return must be deferred until the conditions are right, and the conditions are not right. And he knows this, and he stands there anyway, holding the flaming sword that is his own nature, in a posture of necessary refusal, his origin. And here I am working in territories where the sources are thin, and I am extrapolating from the character as the tradition has built it. His origin seems to be in the divine attribute of truth in its most uncompromising form. Uriel is the angel who tells you the thing you do not want to hear. In the Enochic tradition, he is the one who interprets Enoch's visions and does not soften them. When the visions are terrible, Uriel describes them without flinching. When the future is dark, Uriel lights it with his own light so that it can be seen clearly. This is not cruelty. This is the love of someone who understands that looking at the truth, however terrible, is the only path through it. His trial is continuous. There is no single moment of crisis and resolution for Uriel. His entire existence is the trial, the endless commission of maintaining the order that everything in the fallen world tends to dissolve. Every morning that the sun rises is a small victory over the entropy that would unmake the regularity of creation. Every night that the stars take their proper paths is a testament to his unflagging maintenance. There is no applause for this. There are no stories told about Uriel defeating a great enemy or delivering a world-changing message. There are only the mornings and the evenings and the seasons in their sequence and the stars in their courses. His legacy is the world's legibility, the fact that the cosmos is knowable, that its patterns can be studied, that its cycles can be mapped, that the human mind can develop science and mathematics and calendar and agriculture, because the universe behaves in ways that can be predicted. This is Uriel's gift. The regularity of the world is not automatic, it is maintained. Anyway, there were others, 3 more of the 7, whose stories are preserved in fragments, in contested attributions, in texts that the major traditions held at arm's length: Sarakael, Raguel, Remiel. And I want to be honest with you that the sources for these 3 are thinner, and that the tradition has not been as generous with their individual narratives. Sarakael appears in some Enochic texts as the angel set over the spirits who sin, which makes him something like the divine prosecutor, the one who brings charges, who names the wrong that has been done, who refuses to let the transgression pass unnamed. Raguel is the angel of justice, the enforcer of fairness among the angelic host, the one who ensures that the heavenly court operates by its own principles, that the divine standard is applied to divine beings as rigorously as it is applied to human ones. Remiel governs the souls of the deceased in the oldest sources, a shepherd of the departed, the companion through the transition from one mode of being to another. These 3 receive less page, less attention. The tradition moved on from them quickly, focused its imagination on the first 4. I noticed this, and I am not sure if it reflects something true about the relative importance of these figures, or simply the accidents of textual survival. What was copied? What was preserved? What caught the interest of later editors and commentators? But I will not pretend they received equal care in my telling, because they did not, and you would notice the seam if I tried. The collective crisis, the moment when all of these stories converge, when the individual narratives of the 7 find their intersection in a single event of cosmic significance. This is the event that the tradition calls, with appropriate ambiguity, the war in heaven. The war in heaven is not one event. It is 3 events, or one event told from 3 perspectives, or a pattern that repeats at different scales: primordial, historical, eschatological. In the primordial telling, it is the conflict among the angels before the creation of humanity, the constitutional crisis I described earlier, the division between those who wished to enter the created order on their own terms and those who maintained the boundary. In the historical telling, it is the ongoing conflict played out through human history, the struggle between the forces of order and the forces of dissolution, visible in the rise and fall of empires, in the moral condition of individuals and societies, in the great recurring pattern of civilization built and broken and built again. In the eschatological telling, it is the final conflict yet to come, the culmination of the whole vast narrative, in a confrontation that will resolve the tension that has sustained the cosmos since the first rupture. The tradition is most vivid about the primordial version, and so it is the primordial version I will dwell on. The book of Revelation gives us the image that has lodged most deeply in the Western imagination. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon and his angels, and the dragon, the old serpent, the devil, Satan, is thrown down from heaven to earth. The image is breathtaking in its economy, but the older sources give us something more layered. In the Enochic tradition, the primordial conflict is not primarily about the dragon. It is about the Watchers, the 200 divine beings, led by Semjaza, and Azazel, who looked down at the daughters of men and found them beautiful and descended to take wives from among them, against the established order, against the terms of their commission. The crime of the watchers is not desire. Desire, the tradition insists, is not itself the problem. Even divine desire, even the deep yearning of heavenly beings for contact with the created world. The problem is the mode. The problem is the unauthorized descent, the insertion of divine power into the human sphere without the consent of the divine will, the use of angelic capacity to satisfy angelic preference in a realm that was not theirs to use. What the Watchers did to humanity is a species of the same wrong that the fallen angels will do in the eschatological conflict, the imposition of a greater power on a lesser one in a way that bypasses the consent of both the lesser and the supreme. The results were not simple evil. This is the tradition's most uncomfortable insistence. The Watchers taught humanity to forge iron and bronze, the foundation of civilization as the ancient world understood it. They taught the interpretation of omens, the reading of the stars, the arts of enchantment and healing and cosmetics, and the crafting of weapons. The Book of Enoch is specific about this, almost to the point of making you wonder whether the author is sympathetic to the Watchers or not. They brought knowledge, real knowledge, the kind of knowledge that transformed human life from a precarious scavenging on the margin of survival into the project of organized civilization. And then their children, the Nephilim, giants, beings of immense power who shared in both the human and the divine, began to consume everything in reach. The earth groaned. The blood of those consumed by the Nephilim cried out to heaven. The cry reached the 4 archangels, Michael, Sarakael, Raphael, and Gabriel in the Enochic enumeration, and they brought it before the divine presence. And the response was the commission of each to address a specific aspect of the crisis. Sarakael was sent to warn Enoch himself, to use the human prophet as the divine messenger to the Watchers, which has a particular and devastating irony. The beings who descended unauthorized to interact with humanity now receive judgment through a human intermediary. Gabriel was sent to destroy the Nephilim, to turn them against each other, to allow the forces of destruction that the Watchers had unleashed to consume themselves. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel, the Watcher who had taught the arts of weaponry and cosmetics, the arts of war and the arts of beauty together, as if they were always going to be used in the same projects, and to cast him into the darkness and lay jagged and rough stones upon him and cover him in darkness, and he shall dwell there forever. And Michael was sent to bind Tsimtsum and the other Watchers, and after the children of men have died and the Watchers have seen the destruction of their beloved, bind them under the hills of the earth until the day of judgment. This is not a triumphant story. This is a story of necessary destruction of beings with real goods, power, knowledge, love, being bound and punished for the mode of their exercise of those goods. The tradition does not ask us to rejoice. The tradition asks us to understand. There is a difference between things that are genuinely good and things that are good in the right way, and the whole of the angelic narrative is a sustained meditation on what the right way looks like and what it costs to maintain it. The aftermath of the primordial war shaped everything that came after, not in a simple causal sense, Not event A produced event B, but in the deeper sense that a character formed in a formative experience carries that experience forward in ways that are not always visible, but are always present. The seven emerged from the war as a defined and stabilized council, yes, but they also emerged changed. Michael had bound his own kind. Gabriel had turned children against their parents, the Nephilim against each other, had used the forces of destruction that the Watchers had unleashed as the instrument of their own ending. Raphael had descended into the created world and sealed a prisoner who would not be released until the final judgment, who was, in a sense, still there, still bound, the jagged stones still pressing down, a wound in the fabric of the earth that had never quite healed. Uriel, in this telling, kept his post. The luminaries continued. The sun rose. The calendar was kept. And this steadiness, this refusal to let the cosmic crisis interrupt the maintenance of the basic order, was perhaps the most important work done in that period. Because if the sun had failed to rise on the morning after the war, if the stars had gone dark in grief or confusion, the created world would have had no frame in which to process what had happened, no structure within which to begin the slow work of recovery. Uriel's faithfulness to the ordinary was the scaffold on which everything else could be rebuilt. The dispersal of the fallen, the Watchers bound, the Nephilim destroyed, the influence of the unauthorized angelic descent driven from the surface of the world, was not a clean ending. Cleanness is not what the tradition offers. What the tradition offers is continuation under transformed conditions. The world after the primordial war is still the world. Humanity still lives in it. The capacity for both civilization and destruction that the Watchers introduced is not erased. It is woven into the fabric of human culture, the irremovable strands of the knowledge of metals and stars and enchantments and weaponry. The divine will is not frustrated by this, but neither is it entirely satisfied. The world is now a more complicated place than the one that was intended. The relationship between the divine and the created is more fraught, more mediated, more dependent on the patient work of messengers and healers and maintainers than it would have been if the Watchers had kept their station. The lamentation over the fallen is one of the recurring motifs in the older sources, and it deserves more space than I am going to give it here. The grief of the tradition for these beings who were not simply wicked, but were genuinely in love with the world they were not supposed to enter, who looked down from heaven and found it beautiful and were destroyed by that beauty. There is a strand in the Enochic literature that almost reads as tragedy in the classical sense. The wrong action arising from a genuine good, the destruction arising from love, the punishment precisely because the thing loved was real. The Watchers were not wrong to find the created world beautiful. They were wrong to descend into it on their own authority. And the loss of both the love and the lovers is mourned, even as the judgment is affirmed. This is the texture of the tradition. Both things true at once, the judgment necessary and the loss real, the order maintained and the cost acknowledged. Let me say something now about the theme of fate that runs through all of these stories, because it is not peripheral to the narrative. It is the water in which the narrative swims the medium through which everything moves, the question of whether the whole cosmic drama was always going to happen as it did, whether the fall of the Watchers was foreseen, whether the war was inevitable, whether the seven were always going to be the seven and the fallen always going to fall. This question the tradition refuses to answer directly. And this refusal is not evasion. It is a principled position about the nature of fate in a cosmos that includes beings capable of genuine choice. The divine foreknowledge in this tradition is not the same as determination. The divine knows what will happen in the way that someone who can see the whole of a river at once knows where the water will go, not because the water has been forced into those channels, but because the observer's perspective is simply wider than the perspective of the water itself, which can only experience the moment of its own motion. The Watchers chose to descend. They chose genuinely. The divine did not insert the choice into them. And yet the divine was not surprised. And yet the consequences of the choice were woven into the structure of the cosmos before the choice was made, not as punishments for a crime the divine anticipated, but as the natural result of a freedom exercised outside its proper conditions. This is difficult to hold. It is supposed to be difficult to hold. The tradition has never been interested in making it easy, because making it easy would require falsifying either divine foreknowledge or angelic freedom, and the tradition is not willing to falsify either. Memory is the other great theme. The tradition is obsessed with memory, with the question of what is preserved and what is lost, what survives the great catastrophes, and what is swallowed by them. The Book of Enoch itself is structured as Enoch's memory of what he was shown in his visions, a memory preserved in writing, so that future generations who will not have access to the visions directly can receive what Enoch received in mediated form. The preservation of memory is an angelic function. Gabriel, in some traditions, is the keeper of the divine record. Raphael heals what has been forgotten or distorted. Uriel, maintaining the calendar, ensures that the community of the future will know when to remember the things that must be remembered. What is forgotten is not simply lost. In the cosmology of this tradition, forgetting is a form of rupture, a tear in the fabric of transmission, a place where the thread of the story breaks and must be reknotted, with some loss of the original pattern, a seam visible if you look closely. The work of memory, the preservation of the names of the seven, the preservation of their stories, the preservation of the specific texture of each angel's mode of being, is itself a sacred activity, a participation in the larger project of gathering the scattered sparks back toward the source. I want to tell you something about how these stories traveled, because it matters for understanding what they are and what they do. The Book of Enoch was almost certainly composed over several centuries, drawing on much older oral traditions, probably in the Second Temple period of Jewish history, roughly the 4th through the 1st centuries BCE, in the context of communities trying to make sense of the catastrophes of the Babylonian exile, the Greek conquest, the Maccabean crisis, the profound disorientation of a people whose theological framework had been built around a land and a temple that had been taken from them. Into this context, The angelic narratives provided a way of making sense of catastrophe that did not require abandoning the basic conviction that the world was ordered and the divine was good. The disorder of history was not the last word. Behind the disorder, there were the seven holding the posts. The order was maintained, even if it was not visible. This is the transmission function of mythology, to provide a framework within which suffering can be endured without losing its meaning. The story of the Watchers and their punishment is also read through the lens of the community that preserved it. A story about unauthorized foreign influence on Israelite culture, the Hellenizing pressure, the Roman pressure, the endless pressure of dominant cultures on the identity of a people trying to maintain the integrity of their own tradition. The fallen angels who brought foreign arts and married foreign wives are also the Hellenizers who abandoned the ancestral customs and intermarried with the Greeks. The judgment of the Watchers is also the hope that the judgment of the assimilationists will come. The maintenance of the boundary, the angelic maintenance, the seven at their posts, is also the maintenance of the boundary that makes Jewish identity possible. This reading does not exhaust the text. Myth always exceeds its historical occasions. The Enochic literature is not simply a political allegory, but the political dimension is there, and it is part of why these stories mattered enough to be preserved across centuries of transmission, to be translated into Greek and Ethiopic and Latin and Aramaic and Syriac, to find their way into the community at Qumran, where they were copied and recopied with the reverence due to sacred scripture, to influence the writers of the New Testament and the early church fathers and the Islamic tradition and the mystical traditions of Judaism that would eventually crystallize as Kabbalah. Something in the story was true enough to survive. The modern encounter with these texts is strange and a little vertiginous. I notice something here, a kind of shimmer where the ancient and the now almost touch, where you can almost hear someone from a later century reading these texts on a screen, wondering what it means to take them seriously in a world that has mapped the whole solar system and found no angels in it. The shimmer passes, the texts remain. What they tell us about the structure of the human need for these stories, the need for beings of vast power who are nonetheless accountable, who maintain the order that we can see breaking around us daily, who remember us and fight for us and sometimes bind us when we have gone wrong. This need is not less real because the solar system has been mapped. The astronauts who traveled to the moon brought the cameras and the instruments of scientific measurement, and they looked back at the Earth and they wept. Something larger than technical description was required. Something always is. The seven archangels persist in the imagination, not because people are foolish or credulous or afraid of the dark. They persist because they are an elegant solution to a genuine theological problem. How does an infinite and perfect divine reality relate to a finite and imperfect created world without either destroying it with a force of direct contact or abandoning it to its own confused devices? The answer the tradition developed is through intermediaries, through beings who partake of both natures, sufficiently divine to carry the divine will without distorting it, sufficiently oriented toward the created world to understand what the created world needs. The seven are the solution to this problem, each in a different mode. Michael in the mode of strength and protection, Gabriel in the mode of communication, Raphael in the mode of healing, Uriel in the mode of illumination and order, the others in the modes of justice and memory and transition. What the tradition got right, and I think it got something genuinely right, whether or not you believe in angels as literal beings, is that these modes of divine engagement with the world are real. They exist. The world really does require protection, and there are beings and forces and principles that provide it. The world really does require communication, the transmission of truth across the gap between what we know and what we need to know. The world really does require healing. It requires order. It requires justice and memory, and someone to accompany us through the transitions we cannot avoid, where those forces come from, what their ultimate nature is, whether they are beings with names and luminous forms, or structures in the fabric of reality, or aspects of the divine nature, or functions of the human community. This the tradition holds open, and the holding open is not a failure. It is a recognition that the question is larger than any single answer. The names have traveled far. Michael is the patron of soldiers and of those who use force justly, yes, but also of the paralyzed and the sick. The warrior who is also, in some traditions, the healer, the one whose strength is turned equally to protection and to restoration. Gabriel is the patron of communications workers, of postal services in the older Catholic calendar, of all who carry messages across distances, a specificity that feels almost comical until you notice that communication is always sacred, that the gap between one mind and another is always a distance that requires something like grace to cross. Raphael is the patron of travelers and of those who heal, which is the same commission in different registers. The doctor who accompanies us through the dangerous territory of illness is the same figure as the guide who leads us safely through the dangerous territory of the road. Uriel is less well defined in the popular imagination, perhaps because maintenance is always less glamorous than the dramatic functions. Perhaps because the gift of regularity is the gift we notice only in its absence. What is a metaphor for something like this? I reached for one earlier, the compass needle, the river, the scaffold, and none of them quite held. The seven archangels are like, and here I realize the comparison is going to collapse before I finish making it. They are like the infrastructure of a city, the pipes and the cables and the load-bearing walls that nobody thinks about until they fail. And when they fail, everything fails. And then you understand that the whole habitable shape of the place was dependent on something you never saw. That is not quite right either. Infrastructure is inert. The angels are anything but. The tradition insists on their personhood, their individuality, their specific and particular ways of being. Michael is not a generic strength. He is a specific one. The strength that knows what it costs to fight your own kind, and does it anyway because the order must be maintained. Gabriel is not the generic messenger. He is the specific messenger whose announcement begins with reassurance, who knows that truth that terrifies needs tenderness alongside it, or it destroys the capacity to receive it. These are not abstractions. They are. The tradition insists, and I find myself, against my own uncertainty, inclined to agree. They are persons, or person-shaped, or person-aspiring. The category of personhood is the tradition's way of saying, this is not a mechanism, this is a relationship. The stories end, in the eschatological imagination, with a final resolution of the tension that has sustained the cosmos since the first rupture. The bound watchers are released for their final judgment. The dragon, cast down to earth, makes one last attempt to unmake the order. Michael leads the armies of the loyal host. The old conflict is resolved. The gathered sparks return to the source. The shattered vessels are made whole. The garden is restored, not to what it was, because the restored world is not a return but a completion, not the innocence of before the knowledge, but the wisdom of after the journey, the integration of everything that was learned in the long catastrophe of freedom. Whether that resolution is something that happens in history, at the end of history, outside of history altogether, the tradition holds all of these options open with equal firmness. What matters is the direction. The movement is toward wholeness. The seven are the agents of that movement in their different modes, in their different posts, in their ceaseless and unacknowledged maintenance of the conditions that make the movement possible. I want to close because we have been traveling for a long time and the night is getting late, with something I find genuinely moving about this tradition, and I will try to say it plainly. The seven archangels, in the fullest version of the tradition, do not exist for their own sake. They exist for the sake of the world they maintain and protect and heal and illuminate and accompany. This means that their greatness, their luminosity, their immense power, their capacity for things that exceed human comprehension is entirely in the service of something other than themselves. They burn not to be seen burning, but to illuminate what needs to be seen. They fight not for glory, but for the maintenance of a world in which glory is possible. They heal not because healing makes them greater, but because the broken thing needs to be made whole. They remember not for their own sake, but so that the future will have access to what the past earned. This is a portrait of a certain kind of love, a love that is not diminished by service, but expressed through it, a love that is not conditional on recognition or return, a love that maintains its quality regardless of whether the world it serves is grateful or even aware. The tradition is not naive about this. The tradition knows that the world mostly goes about its business without thinking about the seven at all. That the sun rises and the stars keep their courses, and most people never pause to think about what it would mean if they didn't. Who or what maintains that regularity? What is the nature of the faithfulness at the heart of the cosmos that keeps the basic order intact in the face of everything that tries to dissolve it? But the tradition holds that the unthought of maintenance is still happening, that the work is still being done, that somewhere in the structure of things, in the deep logic of the cosmos, in the nature of the divine that cannot be directly apprehended, but can be approached through the mediating function of these great and luminous presences, somewhere the seven are still at their posts, and the order holds. For now, what comes next is a story that has not been told yet. Good night, wherever you are. Thank you for spending this dark with me. Take care of what is in your keeping. Remember what is worth remembering. And if you wake in the night and cannot name what you feel, consider that it might be gratitude for the sun that is already arranged to rise, for the wounds that are, even now, in the process of being attended to, for the messages still in transit, for the order that holds while you sleep. Good night.